There is an engine sitting in a garage somewhere in America right now that NASCAR banned before it ever turned a single competitive lap. Then NHRA banned it. Then it came back. Then NHRA quietly, with no announcement, no press release, no explanation, let it run again. This engine was built in 90 days by a team of Ford engineers who were told do whatever it takes. It produced more horsepower than anything America had ever seen. And the moment the competition realized what Ford had built, they ran straight to the rulebook. Not once, twice. The name of this engine is the Ford 427 SOHC, the Cammer. And if you were standing at a drag, strip in 1966 or 1967, and watched one of these things leave the line, you never forgot it. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why this engine scared the entire American motorsport establishment and why the full story has never quite been told correctly. Let's go back to February 1964. February 23rd, 1964. Daytona International Speedway. Ford went into that race confident. The 427 high-riser V8 had been dominant in NASCAR for the better part of a year. Ford was winning races. Ford was selling cars off the back of those wins. Everything was working. And then Richard Petty showed up. Not just Petty, the entire Chrysler team. And under their hoods was something Ford had never seen before in competition. The 426 Hemi. What happened next was not a race. It was a statement. Chrysler-powered cars finished first, second, and third. Ford's 427 high-riser, the engine that was supposed to be dominant, was not just beaten. It was embarrassed. The gap in performance was immediate and undeniable. Henry Ford II, the grandson of Henry Ford himself, the man running the entire Ford Motor Company, was watching that race. And he was not a man who accepted humiliation quietly. By the time the checkered flag dropped at Daytona, while the Chrysler team was still celebrating, Ford engineers were already receiving phone calls. The message was simple. Build something that beats the Hemi. Build it fast. Build it now. What those engineers produced in the next 90 days is still talked about today in garages, at car shows, in the kind of quiet conversations that happen when serious people talk about serious machinery. They called it the 427's OHC, the Cammer, the 90-day wonder. Let me tell you what the Cammer actually was, because the engineering here is something else. Ford's engineers started with a foundation. They already trusted the 427 FE side-oiler block. This was a proven race-hardened engine that had won races at Daytona, at Le Mans. In every serious competition, Ford had entered it. But the block was just the starting point. What they built on top of that block was completely new to American V8 racing. They threw out the pushrods. In their place, they designed a single overhead camshaft for each bank of cylinders, one cam sitting right on top of each cylinder head, directly operating the valves without the mechanical middlemen that every other American V8 relied on. SOHC, single overhead cam. That's where the name Cammer came from. The combustion chambers were redesigned as hemispherical, the same basic concept Chrysler had used in the Hemi, but Ford's own interpretation of it. Better airflow, better flame propagation, more power per cubic inch. The valvetrain used stainless steel intake valves and sodium-filled exhaust valves, technology borrowed from aircraft engines. The spark plugs were repositioned inward, giving the Cammer heads a look that was immediately visually distinct from any other American V8 of the era. One look, and you knew what you were looking at. And then there was the timing chain. To drive those overhead camshafts from the crankshaft way down in the block, Ford needed a chain that ran nearly 7 feet in length. 7 feet. The longest timing chain ever fitted to an American V8 engine. It was a beast to manage. Under high RPM, that chain would stretch. Timing would drift. Racers would eventually develop gear drive systems to replace it. But at 7,500 RPM on gasoline, with dual 4-barrel carburetors, this engine produced 657 horsepower. 657. With a single 4-barrel, 616 horsepower. Many of the men who built it and raced it believed the actual output was closer to 700. In 1964, at a time when a high-performance street car might have 350 to 400 horsepower, on a good day, this engine was in a different universe. Ford had built their Hemi killer. They were sure of it. There was just one problem. The man who controlled NASCAR didn't see it the same way. Bill France Sr. built NASCAR from the ground up. He was the founder, the rule maker, the final authority on everything the sport did or didn't do. If Bill France didn't approve it, It didn't happen. And when Ford came to France with the 427 SOHC, when they showed him what they had, built and asked for approval to race at France, looked at the engine and said no. His stated reason was philosophical. He believed NASCAR was supposed to feature American V8 engines in the traditional pushrod layout. Overhead cams, he said, were too European, too exotic, not in the spirit of the sport. That's the official explanation. But there's something France couldn't ignore on a practical level either. He had just watched Chrysler show up with the 426 Hemi and demolish everyone at Daytona. The engine war was escalating faster than the sport could handle. If Ford brought a Cammer, Chrysler would respond. GM would respond. In 12 months, NASCAR wouldn't be stock car racing, it would be an unlimited engineering arms race. France moved to stop it before it started, on October 19, 1964. In a decision that shocked both Ford and Chrysler, NASCAR officially banned all special racing engines from Grand National competition. Both the Cammer Ford and the Chrysler 426 Hemi were eliminated in a single stroke. Chrysler responded by pulling out of NASCAR entirely in protest. Ford stayed, continued racing with its conventional 427 pushrod engine, and lobbied hard throughout all of 1965 for NASCAR to reverse the decision. They didn't get the reversal they wanted. In April 1966, NASCAR offered what they called a compromise. The Cammer could race but only in full-size galaxies, and with a minimum weight of 4,400 pounds. Do the math. A Cammer-powered Galaxy at that weight would have been more than 400 pounds heavier than a Hemi-powered Chrysler car. Ford rejected the offer, walked away from the Cammer's NASCAR future entirely, and pointed the engine toward drag racing, where NHRA welcomed advanced technology, at least for now, with open arms. What happened next is why we're here today. With NASCAR door closed, Ford looked at the NHRA drag racing landscape and saw exactly the right place for what they had. The factory experimental Class A/FX was precisely what it sounded like. Advanced technology. Factory engineering. No apologies. These weren't stock cars with upgraded engines. They were purpose-built factory race cars, with fiberglass body panels to save weight, altered wheelbases to improve traction and weight transfer, and the most aggressive engine combinations the factories could put together, and Ford put Cammers in them. The 1965 factory-backed A/FX Mustangs and Mercury Comets arrived at drag strips across the country with the 427 SOHC under their hoods. The reaction from the competition was immediate. These cars were fast. Immediately, obviously, uncomfortably fast. Bill Lawton, one of the Ford factory drivers, won both the NHRA Winter Nationals and the AHRA Winter Nationals in early 1966. Dino Don Nicholson, a veteran racer who understood how to get maximum performance from NBND, Cammer-powered Comet that became one of the most feared cars in the country. Connie Kalita, the legendary bounty hunter, received one of the early engines and began developing it for top fuel competition. In 1967, in his Cammer-powered dragster, Kalita achieved a quarter-mile speed of 219 miles per hour, a record at an AHRA national event that announced to everyone exactly what this engine was capable of when fed nitromethane and forced induction. Pete Robinson Sneaky, Pete worked with Harvey Crane of Crane Cams to redesign the Cammer's notorious timing chain into a proper gear drive system. That single modification transformed the engine's reliability. The 7-foot chain that had been the Cammer's Achilles heel became a non-issue. With a supercharger bolted on and nitromethane running through it with the timing chain, problem solved. The 427's OHC was producing somewhere in the range of 2,500 horsepower. 2,500. In an era when the Chrysler Hemi, the engine the Cammer was built to destroy, was considered the gold standard of drag racing power. Mickey Thompson, one of the most creative and aggressive minds in motorsport history, built a Cammer-powered 1969 Mustang, funny car team featuring drivers Danny Ongeis and Pat Foster. Nobody could touch them. By the late 1960s, the Ford 427's OHC hadn't just found a home in drag racing, it had conquered it. And that's when the same thing that happened in NASCAR started happening in NHRA. The legends who drived it, names you know. Before we get to what happened next, I want to spend a few minutes on the men who drove these cars, because they deserve that. Dino Don Nicholson. ***, Michigan-born. Methodical. One of the best engine tuners in the history of the sport. He campaigned Cammer cars in both coupe and flip-top funny car configuration. His 1966 and 1967 Comet funny cars were among the most successful camber-equipped machines ever built, feared at every event they entered. Connie Kalita, the bounty hunter, a man who drove with a controlled aggression that few could match. Kalita's development of the Camar for top fuel use, his willingness to take the engine further than anyone had before, produced some of the most remarkable runs of the 1960s. He never gave up on the engine. Years later, when asked about it by journalists, Kalita said the basic Camar design with modern updates would still make a formidable top fuel engine today. Sneaky Pete Robinson. Pete Robinson was the kind of engineer-driver combination that appears once a generation. He didn't just drive the car, he redesigned what needed redesigning. His gear drive solution for the Cammer's timing chain problem was the innovation that allowed other teams to push the engine into territory Ford's own engineers hadn't planned for. Mickey Thompson. Thompson was operating on a different level entirely, a man who had driven a car over 400 miles per hour at Bonneville. A man who looked at any piece of machinery and immediately saw how to make it faster. His 1969 Mustang Camar funny car team wasn't just winning races, it was changing what winning looked like. Eddie Sharpman, Jack Chrisman, Gas Ronda. Names that may not mean much to people outside this world, but in the drag racing community of the 1960s, they were the men everyone watched. And all of them, at various points, ran the Cammer. These weren't just drivers. They were the last generation of men who built their own engines, tuned their own cars, made their own decisions, and showed up at the starting line with nothing between them and the wall except their own skill and the machinery they had created. When the Camar was banned, their era ended too. Second ban NHRA kills IT2. By 1969 and into 1970, the political pressure inside NHRA had reached a breaking point. And I want to be clear about something here because the official history is a little sanitized. The pressure to ban the Camar wasn't coming from safety concerns. It wasn't coming from technical complexity arguments. It wasn't coming from any high-minded principle about the nature of drag racing. It was coming from the competition. Chrysler teams were watching their Hemi cars, the most dominant drag racing engine of the previous decade, get beaten by Ford Camar cars. GM teams had their own interests in the political dynamics of the sport. When the dominant engine in a class belongs to one manufacturer, and that manufacturer's competitors have the ear of the sanctioning body, the outcome is usually predictable. The pressure built, the lobbying intensified. And NHRA, which had welcomed the Cammer into the factory experimental and top fuel classes years earlier, began looking at ways to restrict it. The restriction came in the form of class restructuring and rule changes that effectively eliminated the Cammer's competitive home. The factory experimental class that had been the Cammer's original domain was fundamentally altered. The rules for top fuel and funny car classes tightened around specifications that the Cammer could not meet without modifications that erased its advantages. Ford, meanwhile, was already beginning to withdraw factory support from drag racing. The muscle car era was entering its final years. Insurance costs were rising. The political climate around high-performance cars was changing. When Ford pulled back its financial support for the Camar program in the drag racing world and the rule changes made competitive campaigning difficult, the engines era in professional national competition effectively ended. By the early 1970s, the Ford 427 SOHC Cammer had been frozen out of the sport it had dominated for the better part of a decade, banned by NASCAR before it raced, squeezed out of NHRA after it dominated. Only about 500 Cammer engines had been built between 1964 and 1967. Most of them had been raced hard. Many were destroyed in competition. The ones that survived became almost immediately rare, and then slowly, quietly, over the following decades, something started to change. Here's the part of this story that most people don't know. The Camar came back, not with a press conference, not with an official announcement, not with any of the fanfare that surrounded its original arrival. It came back the way things usually come back in American motorsport, through the back door of nostalgia, and through the persistence of men who refused to let it go. The NHRA nostalgia classes the nostalgia top fuel, the nostalgia funny car. Comp Eliminator created a home for the machinery and engines of the 1960s that had been legislated out of the modern sport. And in those classes, the 427 SOHC Cammer found its way back to the starting line. The engines that had survived the ones in private collections, the ones that had been carefully stored, the ones that had been rebuilt by men who still knew how they worked, came out of garages and back into competition. Carroll Carter, an engine builder from Manassas, Virginia. Virginia, who had been a commerce specialist for decades, became one of the key figures in maintaining the engine's availability for nostalgia racers. He had been manufacturing parts and rebuilding engines since the 1990s. His knowledge kept the Cammer alive in the sport when almost everyone else had moved on. In nostalgia competition, these cars ran again. The sound, that specific, distinctive sound of a supercharged Cammer at full power, came back to drag strips where people who remembered the original era stood at the fence and felt something happen in their chest. Because that's what that sound does to people who heard it the first time. It doesn't just hit your ears, it hits your memory. Connie Kalita, who had campaigned the Cammer as a young driver and gone on to build one of the largest professional drag racing operations in the country, told interviewers that with modern engineering updates, the basic Cammer architecture would still be a serious power plant. He wasn't wrong. The overhead cam principle that Bill France called too European in 1964 and that NHRA had squeezed out of professional competition by 1970 is the foundation of every high-performance engine Ford makes today. The Coyote V8, the Predator in the GT500, the Voodoo in the GT350. Every one of them owes something to the engineering decisions made in that 90-day sprint in 1964. The Cammer didn't just come back to the drag strip. It came back in every Ford engine built in the last 30 years. I want to step back and tell you what this story is really about. Because on the surface, it looks like a story about an engine, about rules and bans and politics, but it's actually a story about power and who gets to decide what's allowed to be excellent. Ford built the Cammer because they were losing. They built it in 90 days with a team of engineers working at a pace that the modern automotive industry would consider impossible because Henry Ford II looked at Daytona 1964 and decided that defeat was unacceptable. That engine was the product of pure American industrial will. No committees, no 5-year product plans, no market research. Just a directive from the top: build something that wins, and a team of engineers who delivered. And the moment they delivered, the establishment found a way to stop it. Not because it was dangerous, not because it was unfair in any objective sense, but because it was too good, because it disrupted the existing order, because the teams and manufacturers who were comfortable in their positions didn't want to deal with what the Cammer represented. This happened at NASCAR in 1964. It happened at NHRA by 1970. And both times, the method was the same: change the rules, restructure the classes, make the playing field inhospitable to the thing you don't want competing. Now, I'm not going to tell you that was all purely corrupt. Sanctioning bodies have legitimate interests in competitive balance, in keeping costs manageable, in ensuring that no single manufacturer can dominate the sport so completely that everyone else gives up. Those are real considerations. But there's something uncomfortable in the Cammer story that doesn't get talked about often enough. The most innovative engine in the history of American drag racing, the only engine in NASCAR. History banned before it turned a competitive lap was banned not because it broke the rules, but because it was too good at following them. The rules said, build the fastest engine you can. Ford did exactly that. And the response was, we're changing the rules. If you grew up in America in the 1960s, if you were at those drag strips, if you bought those magazines, if you followed those races, you understood something instinctively about what was happening. You didn't need anyone to explain it. You just knew. And 50 years later, it still doesn't sit entirely right. So where does the Cammer stand today? Rare doesn't begin to cover it. Approximately 500 were built between 1964 and 1967. That's the total production run of one of the greatest American racing engines ever made. Most were raced hard. Most were modified beyond their original specifications. Many were destroyed in competition timing chain failures. Bearing failures, the inevitable consequence of pushing an engine to limits it wasn't originally designed for. An unmodified, documented, original 427 SOHC Cammer today commands prices that would have seemed absurd to the racers who bought them new for $2,300 from Gradiat Auto Supply in Detroit. Complete cars, Mustangs, or Cougars, or Comets with documented Cammer histories are among the most sought-after pieces of 1960s American racing hardware in existence. Auction houses handle them carefully. Provenance matters enormously. An engine with a verifiable racing history connected to one of the named drivers. With documentation is a different category of artifact entirely. If you're in the collector world, you already know this. If you're not know this, the Cammer is not just a valuable engine. It's a primary document of a specific moment in American history, the moment when the factories were willing to spend anything and build anything to win, before the insurance crisis, before the emissions regulations, before the forces that would end the muscle car era even began to form. The Cammer exists in that moment, frozen there. 90 days, 500 engines, banned twice, and never, in any meaningful sense, defeated. That's the full story of the Ford 427's SOHC Cammer. The engine NASCAR banned before it raced. The engine NHRA squeezed out after it dominated. The engine that came back through the nostalgia classes and lives on in every high-performance Ford built today. The 90-day wonder. If you were at those strips in the mid-1960s, if you heard one of these engines under power, drop it in the comments. I want to know where you were, what you heard, what you felt. And if you know something I didn't cover today, something from someone who was there, a story that didn't make the official histories, those comments are even more valuable. This history belongs to the people who lived it. Hit subscribe if this is the kind of content you come here for. We've got a lot more coming. Next week, we're going inside the story of the Chrysler 426 Hemi, the elephant, the engine that started the war that built the Cammer, and the political battles inside NASCAR that shaped American muscle forever. If this week was Ford's story, next week is the other side of it. You're not going to want to miss that one. Until then, keep the rubber side down. See you at the line.